Okay, hi guys. So, what is the actual usable dynamic range of the Panasonic GH5? This is the first in a short series of videos I've been working on regarding getting the optimum video performance out of the GH5 and the Sony a7 III, the two cameras that I use the most. Which pitch profile and what settings achieves the best dynamic range and the most accurate colour, and what are the pros and cons of using each profile. Essentially, even though I've owned these cameras for a long time now, I think with some careful testing you can still learn something new to help get the very most out of these wonderful tools. This video is focused on the dynamic range of the GH5, and I will touch upon the pros and cons for certain profiles. In the next vid I'll look at the dynamic range of the a7 III. Then I'll put together a further video that looks into the colour accuracy and the best skin tones with both cameras across various picture profiles. So you may want to visit my channel and watch those vids too, as there will be lots of comparisons and some overlap between all of these. Now, with things like dynamic range, you hear a lot of numbers thrown around. Many of them, in my opinion, are flat out wrong. So I wanted to get to the bottom of the actual usable dynamic range in both of these cameras for video, with the most popular and best suited picture profiles, including high-log gamma, as HLG is one of the profiles we hear a lot about these days. Now personally, I'm not looking at delivering HDR videos just yet, so for me I just want to know if HLG is worth using to get the best DR out of a scene for delivery of 4K SDR videos. Also tested and compared here are V-LogL, CinelikeD and natural profiles. Let's look at my results. We can talk about some pros and cons for each profile, then I'll discuss my testing methods and show some examples. So this is what we're looking at here. So the V-Log and the high-log gamma have essentially the same dynamic range, coming in at 11.5 stops each, with CinelikeD coming in at 10.5 stops and natural coming in at a sort of a flat 10 stopped dynamic range. With the natural profile 10 stops, it's worth mentioning that that is a hard 10, so there's little or no wiggle room at either end. The blacks are then black and the whites are then white. It's quite a contrasty profile. So you will have to nail exposure in the natural profile and there isn't much room for error. The CinelikeD 10.5 stops does have a tiny bit of wiggle room in the shadows, but not much. With the V-Log and the HLG, they really didn't have anything to choose between them in terms of dynamic range. Although I will say the HLG shadows have less colour issues and artifacting, so some might say they're slightly more usable than the V-Log shads. But in terms of capturing information across the tonal range, they really were the same at 11.5 stops. With maybe a third of a stop possible further shadow information there, but that extra info really is noisy as hell and personally I wouldn't count it. So regarding these results, the first thing you need to know is I'm not testing in lab conditions, and with things like dynamic range there is some subjectivity. Not so much in the highlights, as when they are gone, but in the shadows we'll have an acceptable level of noise, and this will vary from person to person and use to use. For these tests, if it was usable information in the shadows and the noise was noticeable but not terrible, then I would count it. Some people would put up with more noise, some people would put up with less. So bear this in mind, I am talking about usable range here, not hypothetical range that no one would actually use for professional delivery. Also worth noting is that these tests were with the GH5. The GH5S has a little bit more usable range in the shadows due to having less noise in general and cleaner shadows. For my GH5 settings, I use 4K 10-bit 150 megabits per second 25p for all of it. And the pitch profiles have been zeroed out, so none of them are custom or tweaked in any way. My ISO range was between 200 and 800. I'll put more technical information in the description if you want to know about lenses and things like that. Let me go over some of the other results and offer some suggestions. So in terms of recommended exposures, for optimum dynamic range, clearly this does vary from shot to shot, whether the subject is backlit or in a dark environment or what have you. But if you want a good rule of thumb, for an average contrasty scene, the natural and CinelikeD profiles can be exposed bang on the nose at 0 if you're relying on the camera's multimetering camera EV readout. Obviously protect your highlights and set your zebras correctly for your profile. Whereas with the V-Log and the high-log gamma, I found best results with most usable dynamic range at +1 EV. I should point out straight away that with V-Log, the GH5 automatically adjusts the EV meter by 1 stop. So if you're relying on the camera's meter, 1 stop over actually reads as 0. So if you use the same settings, same light, same ISO, same aperture for HLG and V-Log, the camera will display your EV as +1 on the HLG profile and a 0 on the V-Log profile. So bear this in mind, it's a bit of a quirk for the GH5 to do this, as I have never seen another camera profile do it. In terms of colour accuracy, I won't go into lots of detail here in this vid, but let's just touch on it as I've just finished those tests. If we're looking at the colour accuracy out of camera, natural is the best option for GH5, with CinelikeD just behind it. CinelikeD can make skin tones a bit too warm or yellow, but that's a general trend I've noticed for all Panasonic colour profiles. In terms of which profiles are easiest to work with, you will find natural and CinelikeD very easy to use, with V-LogL being the most problematic with skin tones, and HLG also suffers from some strange skin tone issues. You can of course get some great lookup tables, or LUTs, to fix most of these colour issues. I have bought and tested quite a few of these, including recently picking up the much talked about leaming LUTs. But depending on lighting and specific situation, you can still run into problems with colours with V-LogL. The very best LUTs that I've tried do still have some skin tone issues, so my scores here reflect that. Also, it's worth noting that V-LogL really does grade better in 10-bit than in 8-bit, and HLG is not available in the internal 8-bit, so for some of the high frame rate VFR options, you either can't use these profiles or you probably shouldn't. As I've just finished testing both the GH5 and the a7iii camera, I'm sure some of you want to see how they compete. Here's the headline figures, and here they are laid out in a graph form, so they're a bit easier to compare. Overall, in my test, the a7iii did beat the GH5 in dynamic range, coming in between 1 stop and 1.5 stops in the lead, with a fair advantage in the highlights. And in terms of colour accuracy, the Sony did have less colour issues too. The S-LogL3 in the a7iii was the winner for dynamic range, but I should point out that S-LogL3 struggles in Sony's 8-bit. So personally, I would say go for S-LogL2 instead with the a7iii, as that camera does not offer a 10-bit internal recording at all. Now, I'm not putting GH5 down here, I'm just sharing my unbiased findings. I still use the GH5 more than the a7iii for video. It does lots of things better than the Sony does, and it has more options and scope for video. So with my test results, you may be asking, how did I come to these conclusions? I figured the best way to get accurate results was to do several very different but thorough tests, approaching the problem from a few different directions, then taking all of those results and averaging them out for a more accurate final number. The first test was using a homemade dynamic range test chart, with multiple high quality ND gels stacked up to give me a 20-stop chart. I then filmed that chart in each profile with a very bright LED studio light behind it. Then going through each shot and determining how many stops of usable information we had, marking the top and the bottom of the range. I also cross-referenced mass sections of these shots in the lumetri scopes, checking I was getting full stops worth of information. The subtle paper texture that I added to the chart helped here, so I could really judge if there was actual information within each cell. I then did this with 3 different varied exposures for each shot to find the optimum exposure for the maximum dynamic range. Also, this increased accuracy, as if there was any deficiencies in the quality of the individual NDs, then when you average out the 3 results from the plus and minus exposures from the top and the bottom ends, you're essentially using different parts of the ND chart as the critical determining cutoff ND gels at the test extremities. The second test was what I call a stop up and stop down test, essentially creating a controlled lit scene and shooting each profile across 16 stops of range, using the aperture and shutter to govern the stops. So essentially, 1 shot exposed correctly, then going down 6 stops underexposed and up 9 stops overexposed. I then went through all the footage and chose a tonal range that you could differentiate between juxtaposed similar tone and counted how many stops it was visible for. The third test was a slightly more intuitive one. I simply shot a high contrast scene with multiple exposures, a few stops overexposed, a few stops underexposed, then choosing the shots that had the most range with protected highlights and information in the shadows. Then compared the breaking point of each profile and carefully ranked them. For this one I found this white Star Wars droid with the light shining directly on it as a useful guide for my highlights, exactly how much that sticker was visible, etc. And then in the background this hairy dead cat mic cover here had some subtle dark texture, so that was a good indicator for when my shadow information had reached its limit. For all my decisions, I also raised and lowered the exposure of the footage in post to determine exactly where the ragged edge of each image's available information was. This was very important for the HLG footage in the 10-bit space, as there tends to be more hidden information in that profile due to how the HLG format records its tonal information. I then totaled up all my scores and gave an averaged out final result. And despite the very different natures of some of the ways I approach these tests, the results were thankfully quite consistent, which tells me I'm not making bad assumptions or testing in ways that throws up hugely varied or unreliable results. So here are those results again. It actually took me much more work than I expected to get all this done, several days in fact. So I do hope you find this information useful. Watch out for my upcoming Sony a7 III dynamic range vid, and the videos on the all-important colour accuracy across these cameras and picture profiles, as I will put those together next. Okay guys, peace out, and I hope that was all useful.